Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India. I am Tanvi Taneja. Up first, let's take a look at the headlines we are tracking at this hour. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi to host virtual G20 summit today. All G20 leaders, including Chair of the African Union, invited. Climate change and green energy to be on the agenda. Israel and Hamas reach a breakthrough deal for a 4-day pause in conflict. 50 women and children held hostage in Gaza to be released. Rescue teams start horizontal drilling in Uttarakhand tunnel as rescue operations enter day 11th. Indian Air Force flies specialist equipment ready. South Korea is set to suspend military agreement it signed with North Korea in 2018 as North Korea claims spy satellite launch. So India is hosting this virtual summit of the G20. This is a follow-up on crucial decisions made on the grouping summit in September this year, especially the development agenda, and to discuss other global issues. So over the next hour or so, we will tell you all about the G20 virtual summit. Let's get started. Curtains are coming down on India's G20 presidency at the end of the month. Before it passes on to Brazil, a virtual summit of the G20 leaders will be held in a short while from now. The proposal to hold the virtual leaders summit was announced by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the main leaders summit on September 9th and 10th. The goal is to follow up on all action which was agreed in the Delhi Declaration in the September summit, with focus on climate change and green energy. And DD India's correspondent Akshay Dongre joins us live on the story. Akshay, what are some of the key issues and that are on the agenda on this virtual summit?
Well, Tanvi, yes, you have rightly mentioned that the curtains are coming down on the virtual, in fact, the first virtual summit of the leaders of G20 ever in the history of the grouping. In fact, this is the first follow-up summit as well since G20 was formed, and that is because of the initiatives that have been taken by the Indian government as well as Indian leadership as far as their G20 presidency is concerned. Now, coming back to a question that what exactly are the key issues that concerns the global economy and that concern the G20 countries as well. Now that includes the African Union too. So first of all is the food security that has been hampered with the conflicts going on across the world, be it the Ukraine war, be it the tension that we are seeing, the conflict that we're seeing in the Middle East. Then the food security was hampered, the resilient supply chains that we have been talking about throughout the G20 presidency, those have been hampered. So it remains to be seen that the decisions that were taken by the world leaders as far as securing these food supply chains as well as ensuring food security for the vulnerable nations at least, how is that coming along? The second issue is about sustainable development goals, especially sustainable development growth that is led by women. That has to be seen that where exactly has that reached, because decisions have been taken time and again in these kind of groupings. But what about the follow-up? And that was the idea behind a follow-up virtual summit, so that it takes place quickly and it is to the point as far as the follow-up of the goals that are decided are concerned. The third issue is about the green energy transition that the Global South is very the Global South has been looking forward to. However, there are certain issues that the Global South feels, especially as far as the funding is concerned for this transition that has to come from the developed countries, countries which have huge per capita carbon emission that has impacted the climate extremely and the extreme weather activities that have impacted the Global South countries especially. Then the climate change, other issues such as economic growth, all of these have to be looked at again. The conflicts that have been going on, how they do not in fact hamper the world economy, the oil prices, and all of these issues will be followed up as far as the Delhi Declaration is concerned, how far along the world has come in terms of implementing all of these decisions that were taken in the month of September. and before Brazil is given, or rather handed over the presidency, this will be a good exercise that can be taken up in the future as well by the future G20 presidencies to in fact follow up on the decisions that have been taken by the leaders of the world.
All right. Akshay, as per your sources, which world leaders are going to attend this summit and who are missing it?
Well, as of now, broadly, the invitation has gone to all of the world leaders, all of the leaders who are part of the G20, and this is for the first time the invitation have been sent from the beginning, being as part of chair to the African Union. Now, the African Union comprising of several African countries, a huge chunk of world population, and mostly underdeveloped or developing countries, that is going to be key. So, African Union is going to take part. Other world leaders are also expected to take part as far as the world economies are concerned, both from the developing and the developed world. We have seen that a great enthusiasm when the Leaders Summit took place here in New Delhi, and a similar kind of enthusiasm is expected today by the world leaders as far as the following up of these goals are concerned and the objectives are concerned when the virtual summit takes place today at 5:30.
Okay, thank you, Akshay, for those updates. Request you to stay with us as we play a bit of a timeline for our viewers now. India is hosting this virtual summit of G20 leaders to follow up on crucial decisions made at the grouping summit in September. Take a look at the important initiatives held under India's G20 presidency.
India hosted the G20 Leaders Summit for the first time in 2023. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi chaired the summit on September 9-10. Over 200 meetings were organized in 60 Indian cities. The members adopted Delhi Declaration, which is a symbol of unparalleled global consensus, with all 83 areas achieving 100% consensus across all countries. The declaration focuses on accelerating strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth, effective implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, pursuing low greenhouse gas or carbon emissions through climate-resilient and environmentally sustainable development pathways, to improve access to medical countermeasures and facilitate more supplies and production capacities in developing countries, promote resilient growth by urgently and effectively addressing debt vulnerabilities in developing countries, to scale up financing from all sources for accelerating progress on SDGs, accelerate efforts and enhance resources towards achieving the Paris Agreement, including its temperature goal, pursue reforms for better, bigger and more effective multilateral development banks to address global challenges, improve access to digital services and digital public infrastructure, and leverage digital transformation opportunities to boost sustainable and inclusive growth, promote sustainable quality, healthy, safe and gainful employment, close gender gaps and promote the full, equal, effective and meaningful participation of women in the economy as decision makers, better integrate the perspectives of developing countries into future G20 agendas and strengthen the voice of developing countries in global decision making. At the Delhi summit of the G20, the African Union, which represents the 55 countries in the African continent, was given full membership, like how the EU is represented. Other important events included Global Biofuels Alliance, which was launched under the presidency of India in G20, Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment and India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor was achieved. Unique initiative, which was added during India's G20 presidency, was Voice of Global South Summit 2023. G20 India had a new working group on disaster risk reduction to encourage collective work by the G20. And first of its kind engagement group Startup 20. India also discussed the issue of Russia-Ukraine conflict that brought all member countries to the table to voice as the emerging markets as moderators. India handed over the G20 presidency to Brazil at the closing ceremony of the annual summit of the grouping.
And DD India's Akshay Dongre continues to be with us, and we're also now joined by Ambassador J.S. Mukul, former Deputy Sherpa G20 and former senior diplomat. He joins us from Gurugram. And Professor Swaran Singh also joins us from School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. So first to Ambassador Mukul, as we look back at India's G20 presidency, what would you say were its key achievements?
Well, thank you and namaskar. I think the Indian G20 presidency was in that sense unprecedented in the sense that it had so many achievements. It had achievements on the domestic side where we were able to showcase incredible India. We made it a people's presidency of the G20. But that was on the domestic side. Then in terms of the architecture of G20, we had substantial contributions to make. Just as your report pointed out, we set up apart from the carry forward groups, we established the G20 working group under the Sherpa's track on disaster risk resilience and resistance. We established the working group on equality, gender equality, and women empowerment. We were able to establish the engagement group of the S20 or the Startup 20. In addition to that, that was during our presidency in the run-up to the summit. Coming to the summit itself, the first day itself, we saw the inclusion of the African Union as a full member. Now that was a very seminal achievement because it was first time in 24 years of the existence of the G20 that an expansion was taking place. And it was not just any expansion. It was based on the fact that India had before that made the Global South, or through the voice of the Global South Summit, India had taken on board the Global South Development Agenda. And one of the things missing in that was the Africa deficit in the summit. We started by addressing that in the immediate sense by inviting 3 African countries, Egypt, Nigeria, and Mauritius, but that would have been a temporary fix. In order to address the Africa deficit on a sustainable basis, we took the initiative of including African Union. Now that was, as I said, a very important achievement for 2 reasons. One, it resonated well with the Global South that we had taken because all, if not all, the African countries are part of the Global South, and also was in line with our theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one Earth, one family, one future. That was a major achievement. Then we come to the summit per se. There was a lot of speculation before the summit that we would not have a joint communique, this, that, especially the geostrategic issue of Ukraine was being mentioned as being disruptive or would derail the summit. It was due to the leadership, the diplomacy, the crafting skills, and I think ultimately it was a message of unity and integrity of the G20 summit that we were able to come up with consensus language on this. And then, of course, the joint communique fell in place. So these were the major achievements. Then, of course, as your report just pointed out, there were large number of achievements, 80 plus paragraphs in the joint communique, 80 plus action points in the joint communique. And I think all these are to the credit of the Indian presidency, but also to the credit of all the members of the G20, because as you know, the G20 works on the basis of consensus, and we were able to achieve that consensus.
Professor Swaran, coming to you now, of the key issues taken up by India, including food security, energy, development, health, and digitalization, which would you say received an especially strong fillip under India's presidency?
I think India's presidency, Tanvi, would be remembered for dozens and dozens of firsts that India has introduced. And they are going to stay with the G21, as we now call it, for the coming years.
Yes.
Particularly because, as Ambassador mentioned, the focus of bringing the Global South to the center stage, both in terms of issues that are held dear and are relevant for Global South, also perspectives and strategies that Global South wants to bring to the high table in that sense. So we saw both before India started various meetings of the G20. We had the first Voice of the Global South Summit in January, attended by 125 countries. Again, before we close our presidency with this online summit meeting today, We saw recently another second Voice of the Global South Summit attended by 130 countries. So both there is a understanding of the global south of what India is trying to achieve in terms of building a bridge between the global south or nations that were staying on the periphery of global governance to bring them to the very center stage. I think that is a fundamental change that India has brought about, and my hope and confidence that this change will sustain itself and get reinforced comes from the fact that in coming years also it is the global south countries that are holding presidency. Brazil will take over from 1st of December, followed by South Africa. And if you remember, the Troika leadership of G20 like this, that India, Brazil, South Africa will be for the coming year as well. And we all understand we have had this whole experience of IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, three democracies working together. So they have a sufficient understanding of working together and coordination. So it should be possible for India to continue with issues that it has brought to the table and try to change those, very thought process fundamentally. So whether you look at the quantity of things, the size of recommendation, the number of meetings, the number of cities where meetings happened, number of participants that joined us, 100,000 foreign delegates joined in various meetings. 7 to 8 million Indian citizens were directly or indirectly involved in various meetings. 11 international organizations, 9 special, and so on. And of course, African Union with 55 countries coming. So the quantity itself is a good measure of change. And then of course, quality again is a good measure of change. For the first time, G20 is no longer G20, it is now G21 in that sense. And for the first time, it is happening that India's presidency is seeing 2 summit meetings, one in-person summit meeting, September, followed now by an online summit meeting, fundamentally to do 2 things. One, to deliberate about have we moved forward in implementing the leaders' declaration that was achieved in September, or how should we move forward? At the same time, this kind of a meeting provides also great impetus to that implementation. Second very relevant thing here is that some things have happened since the September summit meeting happened.
Yes.
For example, there was a UN General Assembly meeting. There was also global summit for sustainable development goals stock taking. And there's a general understanding of these lagging behind their targets. Of course, we had now Hamas and Israel war in the meantime. The good news is that simply hours before the summit meeting opened today, both Israel has agreed with Hamas for 4-day ceasefire. That's a great news. And of course, another difficult relationship that India had lately seen was with Australia. And there was some skepticism, and we saw that India has now agreed to open e-visas, particularly for business, medical, and conference purposes. Of course, for some categories like students, employment, tourism, journalism, film industry, and missionary activities, we are still holding back, saying that until safety of Indian diplomats is assured in Canada, then we'll open up completely. So both very positive initiatives, and the skepticism that Justin Trudeau will not join is no longer there. He's confirmed to attend. I'm sure he's attending right now. Of course, one major person that had not attended was President Putin. Kremlin has also confirmed he'll be joining today's meeting. President Xi, of course, will not be joining, so we still will have the Chinese Prime Minister joining it.
Yes.
So I think it's an enormous transformation which India's presidency has brought in and built into the whole structure and process of how G21 will function from now. And therefore, I think India's imprint is going to be very visible in coming years.
Okay, coming back to you, Akshay, now this summit, virtual G20 summit is coming one day after the BRICS Plus virtual meet on the Israel-Hamas conflict. How much of the conflict will be part of the discussions today?
Well, Tanvi, looking at the conflict, and when we look back when the Ukraine conflict started and how it impacted the world economy, how it impacted Europe, how it impacted the markets across the world, how it impacted the sustainable development goals or the resilient food supply chains aims that the countries were working towards, it had a devastating impact, especially as far as food security in Africa is concerned. So conflicts do have a role as far as the economic growth is concerned. In fact, conflicts have been historically devastating for world economy as a whole. So the new conflict that we are seeing in the Middle East can be extremely disruptive. The world economies do realize this, that if there is a spillover of this particular conflict in the Middle East, that can in fact disrupt the oil supply to most of the world, and especially for countries like India that are that are majorly dependent on import of oil. Their economies can get derailed because of the spilling over of the conflict. And it's not just Indian economy; it's about economies of majority part of the world that are risked by a expansion or by a wider conflict in the Middle East. So that is definitely going to be part of the discussions with G20 virtual summit happening. This gives the world leader an excellent opportunity to in fact come and sit together to resolve conflicts like the one that is taking place, be it in Ukraine or now in Middle East, and they can all come and sit together to find solutions to what exactly can be done as far as the conflicts are concerned, and how there can be a resolution to it. We have seen that India during its presidency as well has talked about a United Nations Security Council, and despite we have seen that repeated appeals by the United Nations General Secretary Antonio Guterres for ceasefires, it is only now that Hamas and Israel have now finally decided upon a ceasefire of 4 days. But the UNSC has been coming under a lot of criticism as far as the ongoing conflict is concerned, because it was not able to resolve it in the initial days, and that exactly is the reason that while the UNSC has been losing its credibility, that India and other developing countries have been asking for reforms as well. G20 can be an excellent stage where a democratic process is being followed for replacing of the chairs. Global economies are here, world powers are here, leaders sit here every year and discuss issues. So it can be an excellent stage to discuss the ongoing global geopolitical issues as well, and to find a resolution for these conflicts that in fact danger the entire globe as far as economic growth is concerned, and other issues that especially plague the global south or the developing world, Tanvi.
Okay. Ambassador Mukul, you yourself have been a former deputy Sherpa. Would you agree that the theme we chose of our presidency this year, One Earth, One Family, One Future, under India's presidency, underlined a vision that is key to achieving all other goals of the G20?
Oh, absolutely. I think that theme resonated very extremely well with our civilizational and cultural ethos at one level. It also, I think, summed up with regard to what we were trying to do. We have already discussed about the focus on the global south and trying to bring the whole world together. So I think there is no doubt that that was a very appropriate and a very thought out theme. Coming to the specific discussion that you have been having on what could be the discussed at the summit today. So my take would be that there would be 2 or 3 types of issues. One, of course, is that when the leaders meet, this would provide them another opportunity to review the decisions that had been taken in September, and more importantly, to provide a renewed impetus. Because as you know, the G20 works. The G20 decisions don't get implemented automatically. The G20 sends political impulses, very strong political impulses at the level of leaders, which are then taken on board in the different fora, be it, say, on the multilateral reforms in the IMF and World Bank, on the climate issue in the forthcoming COP28, etc. So this will be a forum for effective implementation, in the sense that it would provide a renewed impetus, momentum, or thrust to the decisions taken in September. The second would be in the September summit itself. There would have been proposals made. We are not aware of all of them, but there would have been proposals made which may not have been fully addressed for the paucity of time during the summit itself. So those could be taken up. And thirdly, as we have been discussing, while 2.5 months is a short time between summits, it is a long time in geopolitics. A lot has happened, particularly the focus, you were just discussing the conflict in West Asia. Now, we should again understand that G20 is the premier forum for international economic cooperation. In that sense, geostrategic or geopolitical issues, strictly speaking, do not belong in the G20. But when, as you know, in experience shows that when leaders meet, they discuss all the issues, particularly the topical issues of the time. And in that sense, I do expect that the West Asia conflict would figure prominently at the summit this evening.
Okay. Akshay, do you see some kind of headway in the G20 consensus on tripling the renewable energy capacity globally by 2030? Why I ask this, because we are going to have the upcoming COP28 summit in the Middle East.
Well, Tanvi, as far as the COP28 is concerned, and as far as the entire issue of the renewable energy and the transition to green energy is concerned, then certainly the topics that have already been decided, they certainly will be discussed among the leaders. But as far as new issues are concerned, there are likelihood that the leaders would like to stick to the issues as far as the decisions that were taken in the Delhi Declaration, and the focus will be on following it up. As far as new decisions are concerned that have to be taken, that probably will shift to Brazil's presidency. When Brazil takes over as the president of the G20, probably they can bring up these issues. But even for the implementation of the earlier agendas, earlier discussions and the agreements, it will be a huge shift as far as the demands are concerned of the global south that they have been raising consistently for the developed world to in fact help the developing world, help the global south in this particular transition. Because as far as the finances of this transition is concerned, it is going to be extremely expensive for these countries. They cannot bear the weight of it. As far as the developed world is concerned, they have significantly higher per capita carbon emission, and they have been historically they have been the countries that have used traditional ways of traditional means of energies that in fact have resulted into higher carbon emissions. And that is why the global south has been asking for some responsibility, or rather accountability, that they have been demanding from the global north in terms of green energy transition. And for that, huge funds will also have to be transferred to the countries that are in fact moving towards transition, especially for countries like India that have huge population, that have a huge industrial base, and that will require extreme amount of resources for this particular transition. So ahead of the COP28, yes, the green energy transition has been one of the core agendas of the G20 of sustainable development goals, and that definitely will be discussed, and there certainly will be a follow-up on whatever was decided in the Delhi Declaration as far as the green energy transition and the requirement of the global north, the responsibility of the global north is concerned toward the developing world.
All right. Professor Swaran Singh, I would like to thank Akshay for being with us. And now let's take this discussion of the global north and the global south to Professor Swaran now. Sir, now the Troika comprises of all the countries of the global south. India, on its part, has held 2 Voice of the Global South summits this year itself. Do you think... request Professor Swaran Singh to be with us, and also Ambassador Mukul. Now we are going live to the address of the Prime Minister at the virtual G20 Leaders Summit.
Welcome and namaskar. Excellencies, we welcome all the leaders to this virtual G20 summit. It is now my honor to welcome the Honorable Prime Minister of Republic of India, His Excellency Shri Narendra Modi, Chair of the G20, to address the summit meeting and to conduct the proceedings thereafter.
Your Highness, Excellencies, नमस्कार। मेरा निमंत्रण स्वीकार कर आज इस समिट में जुड़ने के लिए मैं आप सभी का आभार व्यक्त करता हूं। 140 करोड़ भारतवासियों की ओर से आप सभी का हार्दिक स्वागत है। फ्रेंड्स, मुझे याद है जब पिछले साल 16 नवंबर को मेरे दोस्त और इंडोनेशिया के प्रेसिडेंट जोको विडोडो ने मुझे सेरेमोनियल गेवल सौंपी थी, तो मैंने कहा था कि हम मिलकर G20 को इंक्लूसिव, एम्बिशियस, एक्शन ओरिएंटेड और डिसिसिव बनाएंगे। एक साल में हम सब ने मिलकर ये करके दिखाया है। हम सब ने मिलकर G20 को नई ऊंचाइयों पर पहुंचाया है। अविश्वास और चुनौतियों से भरी आज की दुनिया में ये आपसी विश्वास ही है जो हमें बांधता है, एक दूसरे से जोड़ता है। इस एक साल में हमने वन अर्थ, वन फैमिली, वन फ्यूचर में विश्वास जताया है और विवादों से हटकर एकता और सहयोग का परिचय दिया है। वो पल मैं कभी नहीं भूल सकता जब दिल्ली में हम सभी ने सर्वसम्मति से G20 में अफ्रीकन यूनियन का स्वागत किया। G20 ने पूरे विश्व को इंक्लूसिविटी का जो ये संदेश दिया है वो अभूतपूर्व है। भारत के लिए गर्व की बात है कि उसकी प्रेसिडेंसी में अफ्रीका को आवाज मिली है। इस एक साल में पूरी दुनिया ने G20 में ग्लोबल साउथ की गूंज भी सुनी है। पिछले हफ्ते वॉइस ऑफ ग्लोबल साउथ समिट में करीब करीब 130 देशों ने नई दिल्ली G20 समिट में लिए गए फैसलों की मन से सराहना की है। G20 ने इनोवेशन और डिजिटल टेक्नोलॉजी का समर्थन करते हुए ह्यूमन सेंट्रिक अप्रोच को अपनाने पर बल दिया है। G20 ने मल्टीलेटरलिज्म में फिर से विश्वास बढ़ाया है। हमने मिलकर मल्टीलेटरल डेवलपमेंट बैंक्स और ग्लोबल गवर्नेंस रिफॉर्म को दिशा दी है और इनके साथ ही भारत की प्रेसिडेंसी में G20 को पीपल्स 20 की पहचान मिली है। भारत के करोड़ों सामान्य नागरिक G20 से जुड़े, हमने इसे पर्व की तरह मनाया। योर हाइनेसेस, एक्सेलेंसीज, जब मैंने इस वर्चुअल समिट का प्रस्ताव रखा था तो कोई पूर्वानुमान नहीं था कि आज की वैश्विक स्थिति कैसी होगी। पिछले महीनों में नई चुनौतियां उत्पन्न हुई हैं। पश्चिम एशिया क्षेत्र में असुरक्षा और अस्थिरता की स्थिति हम सब के लिए चिंता का विषय है। आज हमारा एक साथ आना इस बात का प्रतीक है कि हम सभी मुद्दों के प्रति संवेदनशील हैं और इनके समाधान के लिए एक साथ खड़े हैं। हम मानते हैं कि आतंकवाद हम सभी को अस्वीकार्य है। सिविलियंस की मौत कहीं भी हो निंदनीय है। आज हुए हॉस्टेजेस के रिलीज के समाचार का हम स्वागत करते हैं। उम्मीद करते हैं कि सभी हॉस्टेजेस जल्दी रिहा हो जाएंगे। मानवीय सहायता का समय से और निरंतर पहुंचना आवश्यक है। यह सुनिश्चित करना भी जरूरी है कि इजरायल और हमास की लड़ाई किसी तरह का क्षेत्रीय रूप धारण न कर लें। आज संकटों के जो बादल हम देख रहे हैं, वन फैमिली में वह ताकत है कि हम शांति के लिए काम कर सकते हैं। मानवीय कल्याण के दृष्टिकोण से हम आतंक और हिंसा के विरुद्ध और मानवता के प्रति अपनी आवाज बुलंद कर सकते हैं। आज विश्व की मानवता की इस अपेक्षा की पूर्ति के लिए भारत कदम से कदम मिलाकर चलने के लिए तत्पर है। फ्रेंड्स, 21वीं सदी के विश्व को आगे बढ़ते हुए ग्लोबल साउथ की चिंताओं को सर्वोच्च प्राथमिकता देनी होगी। ग्लोबल साउथ के देश ऐसी अनेक कठिनाइयों से गुजर रहे हैं जिनके लिए वे जिम्मेदार नहीं है। इस संदर्भ में समय की मांग है कि हम डेवलपमेंट एजेंडा को अपना पूर्ण समर्थन दें। ये जरूरी है कि ग्लोबल इकोनॉमिक और गवर्नेंस स्ट्रक्चर को बिगर, बेटर, इफेक्टिव, रिप्रेजेंटेटिव और फ्यूचर रेडी बनाने के लिए उनमें रिफॉर्म्स लाए जाए। जरूरतमंद देशों को समय से और आसान दरों पर सहायता सुनिश्चित करें। 2030 सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट गोल्स में तेजी लाने के लिए अपनाए गए एक्शन प्लान को इंप्लीमेंट करें। फ्रेंड्स, भारत में लोकल लेवल पर एसडीजी में प्रगति का एक उत्तम उदाहरण है हमारा एस्पिरेशनल डिस्ट्रिक्ट प्रोग्राम। मैं G20 देशों को ग्लोबल साउथ को एस्पिरेशनल डिस्ट्रिक्ट प्रोग्राम के अध्ययन के लिए आमंत्रित करता हूं। आप देखिएगा कि कैसे इस एक अभियान ने भारत के 25 करोड़ लोगों का जीवन बदल दिया है। फ्रेंड्स, नई दिल्ली समिट में डिजिटल पब्लिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर रिपोजिटरी बनाने का निर्णय लिया था। मुझे कहते हुए खुशी है कि रिपोजिटरी तैयार हो गई है। इसमें 16 देशों के 50 से भी ज्यादा डीपीआई जुड़ गए हैं। ग्लोबल साउथ के देशों में डीपीआई इंप्लीमेंट करने के लिए मैं सोशल इम्पैक्ट फंड स्थापित करने का प्रस्ताव रखता हूं। भारत की ओर से मैं इसमें $25 मिलियन की प्रारंभिक राशि की जोड़ने की घोषणा भी करता हूं। मैं उम्मीद करता हूं कि आप सभी इस इनिशिएटिव से जुड़ेंगे। आज आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस के युग में टेक्नोलॉजी को रिस्पॉन्सिबल तरीके से उपयोग में लाने की जरूरत है। पूरी दुनिया में एआई के नेगेटिव यूज को लेकर चिंता बढ़ रही है। भारत की स्पष्ट सोच है कि एआई के वैश्विक रेगुलेशन को लेकर हमें मिलकर काम करना चाहिए। डीप फेक समाज के लिए, व्यक्ति के लिए कितना खतरनाक है, इसकी गंभीरता को समझते हुए हमें आगे बढ़ना होगा। हम चाहते हैं कि एआई शुड रीच द पीपल एंड इट मस्ट बी सेफ फॉर द सोसाइटी। इसी अप्रोच के साथ भारत में अगले महीने ग्लोबल एआई पार्टनरशिप समिट आयोजित की जा रही है। मुझे विश्वास है कि आप सभी इसमें भी सहयोग देंगे। फ्रेंड्स, नई दिल्ली समिट में मैंने पर्यावरण संरक्षण के संबंध में ग्रीन क्रेडिट की बात रखी थी। आप जानते हैं कि भारत में हमने इसकी शुरुआत कर दी है। नई दिल्ली में लॉन्च किए गए ग्लोबल बायोफ्यूल्स अलायंस के जरिए हम कार्बन को कम करने के साथ साथ वैकल्पिक ईंधन के विकास को भी बढ़ावा दे रहे हैं। G20 ने प्रो प्लैनेट अप्रोच के लिए मिशन लाइफ यानी लाइफस्टाइल फॉर एनवायरनमेंट को मान्यता दी है। 2030 तक रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी को 3 गुना तक ले जाने का आह्वान किया है। क्लीन हाइड्रोजन के प्रति प्रतिबद्धता दिखाई है। क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस को बिलियन से ट्रिलियन ले जाने की जरूरत को पहचाना है। कुछ दिनों में यूएई में हो रहे COP28 के दौरान इन सभी इनिशिएटिव्स पर ठोस कदम उठाने की जरूरत है। फ्रेंड्स, विमेन एम्पावरमेंट पर एक नया वर्किंग ग्रुप भी बना है। इस संदर्भ में मुझे यह बताते हुए बहुत खुशी है कि भारत ने अपने नए संसद भवन के पहले सत्र में एक ऐतिहासिक निर्णय लिया। विमेन लेड डेवलपमेंट को मजबूती देने के लिए हमने पार्लियामेंट और स्टेट लेजिस्लेटिव असेंबलीज में महिलाओं के लिए 33% रिजर्वेशन का निर्णय लिया है। फ्रेंड्स, मैं अपना वक्तव्य यहीं समाप्त करता हूं।
तो G20 वर्चुअल शिखर सम्मेलन में प्रधानमंत्री का संबोधन आप सुन रहे थे और संबोधन
That was remarks at the virtual G20 summit, and of course discussions will follow from here on. We continue to have with us Professor Swaran Singh and Ambassador Mukul. Let's take the discussion forward. Ambassador Mukul, if you are with us, how would you sum up these opening remarks by Prime Minister Narendra Modi? Well, the emphasis was on Global South once again, primarily.
Yes, absolutely. I think the Honorable Prime Minister, in his opening speech at the virtual summit, has very succinctly and briefly summarized the main achievements of the September summit under India's chairmanship. But not only that, what is important is his statement was also forward-looking in the sense that he also mentioned what has been done and what also needs to be done. So I think one, the summary of the salient points, the what has been achieved in the last 2.5 months since then, and of course what can be done going forward. I mean, on specifics, of course, he started by talking about the inclusive, ambitious, decisive, and action-oriented goals that we had set, and he was very gracious in giving the credit to everyone for this, saying that it was only because of the cooperation and jointly with the G20 that we could accomplish this. Then he referred to taking the inclusivity factor to a new height by the inclusion of the African Union. So that was a message. And there he said the voice of Africa. I mean, there is, of course, we are talking of the voice of the larger global South, but he also referred to the voice of Africa being given importance in this. So, and he said that the voice of the global South is echoing today throughout the world, and pointed out that around 130 countries had joined the second Voice of the Global South Summit. Then he also referred very briefly to what I had mentioned earlier, the G20 becoming a people's presidency under India's chairmanship. Then, of course, he came to the West, the problematic geopolitical or the geostrategic conflict in West Asia, where also he said that, of course, we condemn terrorism and the civilian casualties, but mentioned the positive lining with regard to the release of hostages, and emphasized on the humanitarian aid going forward, and linked it up with the one family approach, saying that while violence and terrorism need to be abjured, it is India would walk along with the global community in trying to find a resolution to this issue. Then with regard to the Global South, he emphasized on the development agenda, saying that this had received full support, and of course, talked of making the global economy and especially the global governance structures bigger, better, effective, and future ready. And in that context, referred to the SDG agenda of 2030 agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals, and there pointed out to the very important decision that the New Delhi summit had taken of while everybody knows that SDGs are lagging behind, he talked of the action plan, and in that context he gave a new invitation, saying that we have this aspirational district program on the SDGs, and extended an invitation to all the global South countries to come and see how 25 crore or 250 million people have benefited from this. Then he came to the special Indian achievement with regard to the last summit, that is the digital public infrastructure. A repository has been made ready in the short time since the last summit in September, and already 16 countries and 50 DPIs have been included as part of this. And in that context, he announced, I think it's a very major announcement, of a social impact fund established with the initial corpus or donation or initial contribution by India of $25 million. And he said that he invited the others to join this initiative. Then he referred to the AI, the artificial intelligence, and said how this is so important, but at the same time we need to safeguard against the negative use of this, and in that context spoke of the need for global regulation of AI, and alluded to the dangerous deepfake which has come about. And I think he concluded this very well by saying that this is for the people, it should be for the use of the people, benefit of the people, but also at the same time safe for society. And the last 2 points, I think, which he made was regarding the green credit or the environment issue, saying that the New Delhi summit's Global Biofuels Alliance had taken steps to reduce carbon emissions, and also had the vision of using alternative fuel. And in that context, talk of the people's the pro-people approach leading to the lifestyle for environment, which has been a major achievement of the New Delhi summit. And of course, in that context, also referred to the 2030, the revised goals of 2030 for tripling and doubling of the targets. And in that sense, the clean hydrogen will be addressed, and climate change will move from billions to trillions, and particularly refer to the forthcoming COP28, which will look at this concrete step. And the final point which he concluded with was about the women's empowerment. He said this is the new aspect was, we have in the Delhi summit, we spoke of the women-led empowerment, and in that context, pointed to what India had done soon after the Delhi summit, when in the new parliament building we had announced a 33% reservation in our parliament and state assemblies. So just to summarize this, I think a very comprehensive, at the same time, a very succinct statement of what has been done, what has been achieved at the summit, what we have tried to do in the interim, and also forward-looking in terms of what we need to do going forward.
Right. Professor Swaran Singh, Prime Minister Narendra Modi in his address right now said that under India's presidency, the G20 has spread the message of inclusivity to the world, and that the world has consequently heard the voice of the Global South. Would you consider this as a very significant achievement?
Indeed, in addition to the ambassador's summary of Prime Minister's speech, let me say, I think the fundamental point that he tried to make was how India's presidency has really helped repose confidence in multilateralism at the global level. And in that sense, that is a very positive contribution at the global level in terms of global governance, global decision making. Second very significant point which he underlined as India's contribution was to focus on human-centric development. And that is where this whole Indian narrative on DPIs, digital public infrastructure, is fundamentally changing the narrative on technology transfers that we have seen for the last 200 years. Technologies controlled by developed nations were invariably very difficult for others to obtain, or they were very costly for others to obtain. India is offering its online platforms, whether it is CoWIN or it is digital platforms for payments, e-commerce, for free. And so many nations of the Global South are already incorporating that technology into their everyday life. So technology-driven transformation is what he's underlined in terms of his human-centric development approach, which is where he brought out both the advantages and disadvantages of artificial intelligence. He cautioned world leaders to be careful of the negative impact that AI could have, but also therefore to focus on integrating AI into positive transformation, and underlined and invited world leaders to join the next month's Global AI Partnership Summit that he mentioned in that sense. So I think it's a fundamental transitions that in the way world has functioned so far, which is where he was explaining what is India's contribution. And I was really happy to see he mentioned in detail of how India looks at what is happening in the Middle East right now. He also underlined the fears that it could expand to the region, as he mentioned, and we must make sure this doesn't expand to the region, because you remember we have 9 million Indians. 9 million Indians live in that region, and we don't want war to expand. Second, he made a very fine distinction in saying we must oppose terror and violence. It's not just one-sided. Any innocent life lost is unacceptable. He underlined that in that sense. So I think it's a very well-calibrated, fine distinction that his speech has underlined. And I think that is where India's contribution is, that we are able to nuance our narratives, nuance our worldview, and therefore make some of the very basic and fundamental changes in how global governance must happen, in which, of course, we keep saying repeatedly that the bringing Global South to center stage has been one major success of India's presidency. And of course, in that same sense, pushing forward AI in transforming social life of people. And he mentioned of the Social Impact Fund that he has proposed now, which, as Ambassador mentioned, we are pledging about $25 billion right now for the fund. It could expand in future. And of course, I think this could be a parallel example to Climate Crisis and Climate Fund, which has been a kind of disillusioned reality of $100 billion being, offered and proposed in 2005. Nothing has come about even today. So whether India's initiative on starting a similar social impact fund can look at a parallel example, that here is a small effort which is bearing the fruit, and the other ambitious, thing has not delivered. You mentioned of green credits, for example, moving to hydrogen, transition to, sort of whole alternative economy and alternative fuels in that sense. So I think there's a whole lot of package in a very terse speech that Prime Minister has made right now. as Ambassador said, underlining the achievements, but also underlining the challenges that lie ahead of us and underlying initiatives that India wants to take in coming years to deal with those challenges.
Okay, let's go back to our correspondent Akshay Dongre, who is also tracking this story. Akshay, a very calculated response by Prime Minister on the Israel-Hamas conflict. How are you looking at it?
Well, absolutely, Tanvi. In fact, this is what was expected in the opening remarks, as the experts who are joining us in this show have already mentioned that the G20 is a forum for the world leaders, the world economies, in fact, the top 20 economies of the world, to come together and sit and find ways to further enhance the economic growth across the world. So, geopolitical issues, if they come up, and once they come up, they will have to come up in connection with the economic growth and the economics of the world, and they cannot become in the military sense or geostrategic sense. How they have been brought up by the Prime Minister as well. He has conveyed to all the members that there is no partisan stand that is being taken by the Indian government or the presidency of the G20 that India still holds for a few days now. And in this summit, the aim of the summit is going to be the improvement of economy, the improvement of sustainable development goals, and the issues that concern the entire world. And even talking about the Israel-Hamas conflict, he has taken a very calculative approach. As you have rightly mentioned. But talking about the conflict in the opening remarks that were public, he has certainly taken a very balanced approach. And once he speaks to the leaders can further elaborate and discuss and the ramifications of this particular conflict on the world economy. So certainly that was a calculative approach. However, once the leaders start their discussion and talk about all of the ramifications of this conflict, they are going to go much in depth. They're likely to go much in depth of this particular conflict, because that has implications for the world economy, not just for the countries that are dependent on oil, but also for the countries that are that have huge populations and have a developing agenda, especially in the developing world. Tanvi?
Okay. Thank you, Akshay. And going back to our guests on the show, let's talk a little bit about Prime Minister Narendra Modi's leadership. Ambassador Mukul, would you agree that Narendra Modi's vision and dynamic leadership has led to a huge boost being received by the G20 movement?
Oh, absolutely. I think we have seen this right through the presidency, not just at this summit today, right through the presidency, where he took over from, as he pointed out, from the formally and ceremonially from the Indonesian president in November last year, and right through then the major event was the first Voice of the Global South summit, then actually rolling out the various initiatives and various achievements of our presidency. Mention has been made of the 200 odd meetings in 60 cities with almost 100,000 foreign visitors, and culminating in a very grand summit in September. And obviously, this was only possible because of the leadership shown by the Honorable Prime Minister. Also, I think, as I mentioned in my earlier intervention, the joint communique, while it was achieved, it was a collective effort of everyone. I think it was also the contribution of the Honorable Prime Minister and his standing and stature. All that contributed to crafting a consensus document. And then after that, we saw the second Voice of the Global South Summit just last week. And today, of course, the first time that has happened in the 18 presidencies of the G20 that we have a follow-up summit to the main summit in order to provide a further kind of review, take stock, and provide a further impetus going forward. So yes, absolutely, the Prime Minister has led from the front,
yes.
And I think that is something which would have been noted by all the G20 leaders.
Yes. So, Professor Swaran, the same question to you. How far will Prime Minister Narendra Modi's dynamic leadership of the G20 movement influence other leaders who take over this presidency now?
I think that if you recall the speech made by the President of Brazil in accepting the presidency in September, he clearly underlined how difficult challenge it would be for Brazil to, sort of match up to India's presidency. And I think apart from being modest, he was also underlining something that is a reality. As far as Indian Prime Minister is concerned, it goes without saying. I mean, he's right now one of the most visible and indeed most influential leaders around the world now. In some of the surveys that you see, he's been often also described as the most popular leader around the world. And that really speaks of his personal efforts, the footwork that goes, and of course the entire team that works with him, to make sure that he keeps building personal connections with world leaders. Now let's look at G20 summit meeting. Other than the fact that, we had large number of meetings and so on, and very, extensive declaration, remember, announced at the end of very first session, Ambassador would wear me out, most of such summit meetings have to sometimes their last session so that consensus can be built. Now, that is the kind of leadership that is very, very, really remarkable in that sense. Other than focusing on large number of issues, building consensus, remember, I think reports were that he had about 15 bilateral meetings during those 2 days, other than the summit meeting.
Yes.
And remember the personal touch of taking all the leaders to Gandhi Samadhi. And in that sense, projecting India in terms of father of the nation, democracy of India's tradition being 7,000 years old, the costumes, culture, dance, music, a whole lot of things. I think it takes a lot of thinking that goes behind such things. And I think in that sense, it's a holistic approach to build not just official political relationships and partnerships, but building friendships with global leaders. I think Indian Prime Minister has showcased capacity to do that kind of personalized attention to each of the guests in that sense. Sometimes even, indicating displeasure. And that's a very important thing. The body language also in diplomacy is very significant, particularly at apex level summit meetings. So each gesture, each word, each activity has to be carefully calibrated. And in that sense, I think of Prime Minister being, directly engaged, with each of these details himself. And of course, carrying himself, very, very comfortably with all kinds of world leaders in all kinds of situations, dealing with all kinds of issues, has really, as I said, we may agree or not agree in terms of influence he wields, but there is no doubt he's the most visible leader as of now. And I think that really brings far more upfront when you see him hosting the G20 summit meeting, where, as I mentioned, not just the 19 economies plus European Union, but also the way your African Union, again, was just brought in as a permanent member in the very first session itself before the summit meeting began. I mean, he had done the footwork, Indian team had done the footwork or work behind it to make sure it's not a proposal to be presented, but it's something, a decision which is to be implemented when the summit meeting takes place. 11 international organizations were represented, 9 guest countries were represented. Put together, let me just say G20 today with EU 27 countries and 55 members of African Union is almost 100 countries together. I mean, it's a mini United Nations now. So leading that kind of powerful economies at the same time, 2/3 of global population being represented here, that I think is an enormous opportunity, and India, I think, has done very well in harnessing that unique opportunity.
And strengthening the group of the G20 also. Request you, both of you gentlemen, Ambassador Mukul and Professor Swaran Singh, to stay with us. Our special broadcast on this virtual G20 summit continues. My colleague Anil Thomas will take it from here. We're slipping into a very short break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.